And a hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 29 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I want to thank you all for your continued support, especially those of you checking out the podcast on my YouTube channel. If you've enjoyed the content and continue to do so, don't forget to click like and smash that subscriber bell. Or if you're joining me for the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or the other platforms, if and only if you like what you hear, click like and subscribe. So I'm going to do something I normally don't do in the midst of a podcast, and I'm going to stand because I'm going to show you my shirt. Most of you will have no idea who this is on the shirt. This is a character called Tony Clifton, who was created by a stand-up comedian, TV star, and movie star who never considered himself a stand-up comedian. He was a song and dance man, perhaps the first performance artist, the late, Great Neck, Long Island native, Andy Kaufman. Andy Kaufman was only 34 going on 35 when he passed in 1984. And when I say he was the first performance artist, the nearest approximation to what I'm talking about, just to give you an idea, would be Sacha Baron Cohen. I think a terrific example where we know him as Sacha Baron Cohen. We also know him as Borat and Ali G and some of the other characters that he's played, in various forms of media over the last couple of decades. Now, Andy Kaufman did not break character. And there were moments where he seemed to break character, but then famously on a TV show called Fridays, where he then went back and said, they want me to tell you this isn't real, but it is real. So nobody ever knew what was an act and what wasn't. Now, certainly we've seen in Borat that he ain't breaking character, but the real Sacha Baron Cohen has been himself at various public appearances where he was not clowning and where we got an idea that this is probably how he is when he's not working. With Andy Kaufman, even those closest to him did not know what was real and what wasn't. And I knew of Andy Kaufman because of his association with professional wrestling. And the guy seemed completely off his rocker. But by the time that I learned about him, he had already passed away. He unfortunately died of lung cancer, as I say, very, very young. And the kind of sick irony is he didn't smoke. When he was playing this character of Tony Clifton, he'd light up a little bit. But Andy Kaufman was a guy who kind of lived in a holistic manner. He believed in transcendental meditation and other forms. He was very spiritual, despite the kind of crazy shenanigans that he pulled. Now, the most famous incarnation and representation of Andy Kaufman and this character comes from one of my absolute favorite movies, the second of Jim Carrey's back-to-back masterpieces, The Truman Show, in 1998, directed by fantastic, magnificent, brilliant Peter Weir, who later did Master and Commander with Russell Crowe, which I will argue tooth and nail is the best film that Russell Crowe was ever in. Truman Show, and then Man on the Moon, directed by another all-time spectacular, late great filmmaker, Milos Forman, who did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, won a ton of Oscars with Amadeus, later did People vs. Larry Flint, but he also did Man on the Moon, which has Jim Carrey as Andy Kaufman, as Tony Clifton, and it is an extraordinary film. Also polarizing. There were a lot of people when it came out that didn't like it, that said, well, this is little more than a recreation of Andy Kaufman's most famous bits. We don't really get that much of an idea of what makes him tick. But that's kind of the point. Because when people close to him say, we don't exactly know what made him tick, then they're just kind of doing the best they can, right? So the real Andy Kaufman and the movie version, there was so much mystery because Kaufman was he was constantly playing pranks on people of varying degrees of severity, and even in his act, where somebody would fake a death and then be brought back to life. He famously did that in his Carnegie Hall show. His own family was convinced that he had suffered a catastrophic spine and neck injury during a match where he supposedly had this feud with a terrific famous wrestler Jerry Lawler, and it turned out to be all a work, to use a wrestling term. It was all a work. This entire feud was not actually a feud, but it went on for months, and only a couple of people knew, no, wait a second, these guys are actually buddies. They don't hate each other's guts. In the movie version, Jerry Lawler has talked about, because he played himself in the movie Man on the Moon, where Jim Carrey was very disruptive during filming. And at the time, there were reports that Carrey was so deep into character that it was almost impossible to work with him, because he was channeling Andy Kaufman, Tony Clifton to such an extent that people didn't know, is this guy even here? Has he just completely lost his marbles? And he and Lawler got into what appeared to be a real brawl. Well, obviously, Jerry Lawler could stuff Jim Carrey into a garbage can if he wanted to. And there were all of these other reports of set disturbances, 25 years ago, where the studio was poo-pooing it. But then there was a documentary which came out on Netflix, I think about 4, maybe 5 years ago, called Jim and Andy, which says, yeah, that's exactly what happened, where even the director was having difficulty getting through to Jim Carrey because he was so deep as Andy or Tony Clifton. So this character, Andy Kaufman, was a kind of aspiring stand-up comedian, and he worked at places like the Comedy Store, famously in, I believe, Los Angeles. Could be Beverly Hills. I'm not sure about that. But a lot of other famous comics kind of cut their teeth at the Comedy Store. And the true story, which is mirrored in the film, and it kind of, as in the beginning of the movie, the real Andy Kaufman, which is not, it's Jim Carrey, where he says that a lot of things in this movie, he kind of is breaking the fourth wall and telling you, they mixed up a lot of the events in my life for dramatic purposes. But Jim Carrey was an aspiring so I'm doing it now. Andy Kaufman was somebody who just wanted to be different, naturally funny, very, very quick on his feet, an ability to engage with the audience that had not been seen before in every way, good and bad and ugly sometimes. But he had an ability, and he took risks that nobody had taken up to that point. And the story we're presented with in the film Man on the Moon is that he was trying his stand-up act, and he was bombing until he went into an Elvis Presley impersonation, and the audience at the Comedy Store went fucking bananas. And he had this strange character that he had created, which was informally known as Foreign Man. And a Hollywood agent named George Shapiro, who later produced many TV shows. I want to say that he was one of the producers of Cheers way back when. But he managed a lot of talent. And as the movie recounts, George Shapiro, as played by Danny DeVito in the movie, happens to be at the Comedy Store, maybe scouting for talent. We don't really know. Or he could have just been the real George Shapiro, just, out for the night and, kicking back a little bit. But he's the one who found Andy Kaufman. And he saw an opportunity with this particular character that Kaufman, he thought the Elvis impersonation was fucking bang on, but there's limits to what you could do with an Elvis Presley impersonation in the mid-1970s when Elvis was still alive. And presumably Kaufman took meetings with various executives because Shapiro saw an opportunity, said, I think that I can get this kid work on TV and he can make some good money, and then we'll see where he can go. Because he wanted to have complete creative freedom. That sounds good, but whether then or now, you're a guy in your mid-20s who doesn't know anybody and doesn't have an in the business, doesn't have unlimited amounts of money to spend to do what you want. You have to get somewhere to have that level of control. So Shapiro put him on presumably certain auditions, and a new TV series, which ended up being Taxi. The producers of it were well known in the industry, and Shapiro was friendly with them. And he got Andy Kaufman a gig playing a character modeled clearly after Foreign Man called Latka Gravas. And that character ended up being kind of a breakout character, much like Arthur Fonzarelli was in Happy Days, which had been on the air for a couple of years already. Now, from what we know, Andy Kaufman did not like sitcoms. And we get this in the movie with Jim Carrey, where he is consistently frustrated with the limitations of the medium, that he understands there are certain necessary evils that one has to do, as a character played by the real George Shapiro, who runs a bar early in the film, tells Jim as Andy, this is show business. Show business. Without business, there's no show. And what that means is, you may not like taking part in a sitcom. You may feel that sitcoms are the lowest form of entertainment. But if they're paying you good money and people like it, maybe you ought to be a little bit more humble and a little grateful, because the average stand-up comic, not a comedian, I'm not a stand-up, fine. But almost anybody in the business at your age who is trying to do what they want, this is the stepping stone. This is how you get there. So the movie, which, as I say, I love, I feel like the movie is more interesting than the way that the real Andy Kaufman's career developed. You know, he famously was on Saturday Night Live as a special guest on the very first show, and he did a rendition of Mighty Mouse, which is pretty funny. Here I come to save the day. But I really want to focus on the movie and what the movie has meant to me, just as far as somebody who was a visionary, because Andy Kaufman was not like anybody else. And there were a lot of people who couldn't stand him. You know, he was kind of voted off Saturday Night Live, that he had been someone who was brought on the show every now and then. And they just basically, the audience, they did an audience poll like early days, 45 years ago, or no, more like 40 years ago, audience poll, vote him out. You know, like Survivor, vote him out. And he was voted out. What the movie does is make you care about this guy, even without giving deep insight into what made him tick. He was one of a kind. He was brilliant. He was volatile. But at heart, he really did want people to like him. It's kind of ironic that a man who went out of his way to be antagonistic, particularly as this character, Tony Clifton, who he created out of whole cloth, an obnoxious, overweight, chain-smoking, booze-swilling lounge singer who couldn't sing, couldn't remember the words because he was drunk, and his shtick, his patter, was to insult the audience, wherever he was. He's playing Harris Tahoe, and he's dragging everybody. He's in comedy clubs in LA, in Vegas. He's making fun of everybody. But the real Andy Kaufman wanted to be loved. He wanted to be accepted, despite the fact that he consistently did things to make people actively dislike him. And the kind of dichotomy, the creative and cognitive dissonance, is that he did that while at heart wanting people to love him and people to understand him and care about him. And so the movie version of his life, which as Jim Carrey / Andy Kaufman, and people who worked on the film said that Andy was with them throughout filming, that Jim Carrey was so eerie that he was able to mimic the speech patterns, the facial expressions, the mannerisms, the head movements, the way that he got everything right. And it's an absolute crime, in my opinion, a movie crime, that Carrey was not nominated for Best Actor. I know that Golden Globes, that's great, but he's so good in this dual role of Andy Kaufman and Tony Clifton. And the story develops, and unfortunately, it isn't until Andy Kaufman gets sick that he opens up more, and we realize that he's still a little boy who kind of wanted his father's approval, and kind of wanted to be loved and accepted, and was not at nature, did not seem to be a naturally antagonistic person, but that it was all a character, or in wrestling, it was all a work. It was a work. It was a bit. It was a bit that he extended for years and years and didn't really let go of it until, unfortunately, he was near the end. But the way the film gets you is, and we've certainly seen inspirational movies where a character is sick or dying or, achieves incredible things before passing. What this movie does, without giving it away, is it uses this character in a way you don't expect, in an ingenious way. And another actor that most of us know and love, Paul Giamatti, in one of the best roles of his career, plays Andy Kaufman's best friend, writing partner, confidant, Bob Zmuda. And in real life, in order to keep this kind of charade going that, well, actually, Andy Kaufman is not really this obnoxious POS, Tony Clifton. It's somebody else. Bob Zmuda often played Tony Clifton in public if they had to make appearances together. But people didn't know that at the time. This was how they kept up the illusion that, well, maybe it's not him, because it was kind of an open secret, especially in Taxi when Tony Clifton just showed up and was tearing shit up, that, okay, it's Andy under all this latex. What the fuck is he doing? It's just insane what this guy's doing. But the movie surprises us because despite his antagonistic attitudes, despite his consistently antisocial behavior, we still care. And it's the genius of Jim Carrey's performance that you see it, you feel it from him, that he's really only wanted to be loved. And when he starts to near the end, you wonder, well, we know what happened to the real Andy Kaufman, but how are they going to do this? And the movie does something extraordinary. And without giving it away, there is a moment in the film near the end, again, no spoilers, where there's only one way that Tony Clifton can appear on stage at the comedy club. The only way that he can do it is if a certain other character is playing Clifton. And so we have this big scene about a year after the events of the film proper have concluded. And okay, here's Tony Clifton on stage. We know who's playing Tony. And it's okay. We're confident in the understanding, and we get why they did it this way, because there were two people playing this character, et cetera, et cetera. And Milos Forman ends the film in an ethereal, surrealist, positively ingenious way. And it is one of the best endings of any film I've ever seen. Top 5 for me. Tony Clifton is doing his thing on stage. People are laughing, getting into it because he sings the song, I Will Survive. And he butchers it. He butchers it so badly, but it works because the audience is so happy that Tony is up there. It doesn't matter who's under the prosthetics, whatever. They're going crazy. And as he is getting into I Will Survive, and he's destroying it in a good way and bad way at the same time. He's so bad. He's such a terrible singer. Gloria Gaynor, he's just awful. But he does it with such panache, with such moxie. And you're not expecting this, but the camera pans around and shows Paul Giamatti in the audience crying. And that moment elevates the film from this is super entertaining, what a great story, into a different level, a level of fucking genius. Incredible, holy shit. Because there's no way that you're expecting this ending. And if you're with the film, it hits you. It's like a thunderbolt because you're not expecting it. And all of a sudden, bang! fade out. And Man on the Moon there were very high hopes for the studio, because despite all of the reports of strife with Jim Carrey and Jerry Lawler, and the fact that, Milos Forman was not a guy who liked to complain. He was a director who was, as we see, an absolute genius and had incredible eye, knew where to position the camera, how to create shots, how to put things together. He was not looking to fight, and he worked so hard, and he never really said anything negative about Jim Carrey or his process. There have been people in recent years who came out and said, yeah, Jim just completely lost it there. Even Martin Freeman is like, I don't know what the fuck he was trying to do there, and he's like, I don't really appreciate when people do that. But even with the reports of Carrey's disruptive antics, the studio was holding out hope for a lot of Oscar nominations, at the very least, because Carrey was such a huge star. And The Truman Show had been a massive box office hit, and that was a film that was almost promoted as a comedy, and it's not really a comedy. It has its moments of humor, but that is a sick, dystopian, sci-fi, fucking mind-blowing movie. That ain't a comedy. And Man on the Moon also has a lot of funny moments, but it's not really a comedy either. So the studio was hopeful because of Carrey, and because, hey, we think he's amazing with all the problems he may have caused, but he fucking kills this role, this dual role. He's incredible in this movie. And the film came out, and there were certain critics. I remember Owen Gleiberman, a great critic who wrote for Entertainment Weekly at the time. He thought it was the best film of 1999. And 99, the year of American Beauty, the year of the original Matrix, the year of The Sixth Sense, the year of the Blair Witch Project. There are people that have argued. An author by the name of Brian Raftery, I had a little back and forth with him on Instagram. He wrote a book basically saying 1999 was the single greatest year for Hollywood ever. And Owen Gleiberman had Man on the Moon as his best film of the year. Now, looking back on it, I would agree with him. It's certainly my favorite film. I mean, American Beauty, it's okay. I saw it in theaters. I think it is a massively overrated film. I've never been as big a fan of it. And Kevin Spacey's brilliant, don't get me wrong. And the rest of the cast, they do the best. Wes Bentley, Mina Suvari, Thora Birch. My biggest problem with that movie, Annette Bening was the only person who got the memo that they were making a dark comedy, not a straightforward drama. She reads her lines as if she's in a comedy, and everyone else is acting like they're in Shakespeare. Sometimes that works. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. Angelina is acting as if she's in a drama, and Brad is acting as if he's in a comedy. It works. But in American Beauty, for me, every time Annette Bening, an actress I absolutely love, going all the way back to The Great Outdoors with John Candy and Dan Aykroyd. Bugsy, amazing. I adore Annette Bening. Her performance throws that movie out of whack, because nobody else but her got the memo. This is supposed to be funny. It's not supposed to be a straightforward, Bergman-esque drama as some of you are playing it. So, Man on the Moon got good reviews from critics, good on balance. But there were a lot of critics that did not like the movie. And it seriously underperformed. If memory serves, it was one of the last big films released in that decade. I want to say that it came out, maybe it was Christmas Eve or Christmas, but it was right around that time frame. Talented Mr. Ripley, another big movie from 1999, award level, Anthony Minghella, follow-up to The English Patient, which won 9 Oscars. But the film disappointed, and I didn't actually see it in theaters. I got it on DVD when it hit DVD, and I was blown away. And again, as I have talked about in previous podcasts, I wish that I had seen it in theaters. I didn't. But it is a movie that I absolutely love. I have watched it from start to finish at least 15 times. It gets definitely one of those movies that I can always fire up. And as many times as I see it, have seen it, much like Chariots of Fire, when we get to the end of the movie, the tears are flowing. I can't help it. There are certain films that you wouldn't expect to be tearjerkers that just work. They just hit me right in the gut, right in the feels. And this is one of them. Thanks to the vision of Milos Forman, of course, the supporting cast, Courtney Love, terrific. in a limited role. She has a much broader role in Forman, the previous film he did with Woody Harrelson, great movie, and Edward Norton, People versus Larry Flint, where Woody actually was nominated for an Oscar that year. I don't know about Courtney. But that film also kind of underperformed at the box office. So Man on the Moon was kind of a disappointment, and then Jim Carrey moved away from those kind of films, at least temporarily, and he did, Me, Myself, and Irene with the Farrelly brothers. That was a big hit. And then he did The Majestic, which another terrific film, and that also, underperformed, unfortunately. But Man on the Moon is also a movie that, and there are certain films, and I always talk about, Rounders is a movie that has bounced around every streaming service. In a new month, it's on Netflix, it's free on Prime, now you have to pay, it's on Peacock, it's on Max. Man on the Moon has bounced around from every streaming service. It was on Amazon Prime for free for about a month, took it off. It was on Netflix, took it off. It was on Mac, took it off. All over the place. Paramount took it off. Right now, it's streaming on Peacock free if you have a subscription to Peacock. I know I say this a lot, but I mean it every time I tell you. Man on the Moon gets my absolute highest recommendation. And if you watch it on my authority and you don't like it, light me up in the comments. Or if you've seen it and you're like, bro, fucking movie sucks. It's okay. That's what we're here for, because we're not going to agree on everything. Why would we want to agree on everything? But this movie, to me, is extraordinary. And the character of Tony Clifton, every scene with Tony Clifton in this movie is gangbusters. And you can go on YouTube and just watch the Tony Clifton stuff, and you'll be laughing your ass off. If you're like, I don't really want to watch the movie, but I'm curious about this character that this dude has a shirt for, a long sleeve shirt. So with that brings episode 29 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast to a close. I want to thank you all once again for joining me on this Monday evening in December of 2023. If you're joining me on my YouTube channel and you're enjoying the content, don't forget to click like and bing, smash that subscriber bell. Or if you're joining me for the audio version on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or Amazon Music, and you like this particular podcast, or if you're just a fan of the movie, I don't play any favorites here. Don't forget to click like and smash that subscriber bell. I will be back real soon with episode 30. Take care.